Hi everyone, welcome back to Ethics Analytics and the Duty of Care. I'm Stephen Downs, and I want to wrap up this module with the last of the videos for this module from Module 6, which is the Duty of Care. Almost going back to the roots of theories like those of Carol Gilligan to explore the concept of moral sentiment. And here I'm going to be revisiting the ideas of people like David Hume and Adam Smith writing during the Scottish Enlightenment about the idea of a moral sense, and particularly the motivations for such an approach as opposed to moral reasoning, talking a bit about methods of ethics and experience, talking about moral sentiments as opposed to moral judgments, and then some reflections on learning ethics. This isn't intended to be the final word on any of these subjects, and we'll explore some of them in more detail in Module 8. But it seems like a natural way to wrap up the discussion on the ethics of care and the duty of care, because this idea of moral sentiment underlies a lot of it. And I find that it's fairly easy to get, I don't want to say bogged down, because that's not quite the right word, but to focus perhaps too much on the details of an ethics of care. Not saying that the details aren't important, but we want to understand why these details become what they are. What is it that makes them what they are? And so looking at this underlying idea that informs people like Carol Gilligan and Ned Noddings and John Tronto and others, I think brings us to a point where we have a concrete starting point when we look at ethical practices in Module 8. So that's the plan. I'm going to try again to keep this brief, but you know what my track record on that has been, so we'll do what we can here. So it's interesting because in working out how to present this topic, the obvious contrast comes up between a moral sense with moral judgments. And I actually have a slide later on called Moral Sense versus Moral Judgments. And a lot of ethical thinking is presented as a fairly complex set of moral judgments. And so it's fairly common to see, especially in the non-philosophical literature, frameworks developed in order to describe how people actually go through a process of moral judgment. Now, what I found really interesting is that the starting point for that sort of discussion, which is the work of Kohlberg, is also the starting point for the ethics of care discussion. And what we find is the contrast here that can be drawn both between an ethics of care and descriptions like Kohlberg's, and a more moral sentiment approach and descriptions like Kohlberg's. Because you look at it, we have a 6-step process. Of course, it's a very Piaget influence kind of model. From the perspective of education, we'd say it's a very social constructivist informed model. But also, too, when you look at it, it involves a lot of presumptions about what might be called a physical symbol system hypothesis, or the idea that the brain is in many important ways like a computer, or at the very least a text-based processing system. Look at the steps: encoding of cues, interpretation of cues, clarification of goals. Step 4, response, access, or construction. And then 5, moral response, decision, and then finally behavior enactment. And these occur around an environment based on brain development. So there's the Piaget element. Emotion processes, because morality does involve emotion, and also social factors, because Morality involves social factors, but all those combine to create a database, a memory store, moral and social schemas, rules, principles, etc. And you get the perception, again, as Kohlberg says, that moral principles are necessary, even if they're not sufficient for moral behavior. And I think that Gilligan challenges this directly, and I know that David Hume challenges this directly. So, where we come at this is from a perspective of what we might call personal knowledge. Now, when I see the phrase personal knowledge, I think about Michael Polanyi and his book, Personal Knowledge, which talks about tacit knowledge as opposed to explicit knowledge. And one of the big differences between tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge is that tacit knowledge is ineffable. It has the property of not being able to be expressed in words. It is also, therefore, not a system of rules or any kind of physical symbol system the way we would see on a Kohlberg type theory. The same thing is happening with different language and different background and different framing, I think, in feminist theory. It's interesting, again, we have Craig Dunn and Brian Burton writing in Encyclopedia Britannica, two guys trying to deal with this theory, and they write feminine moral theory instead of feminist moral theory, which is kind of interesting. And they're putting it as opposed to exclusively rational systems with a gender biased nature of knowledge construction. And I think that's all trying to interpret ethics of care through this rationalist, rule-based, symbol-based kind of perspective. But anyhow, what they say, and I quote, feminine moral theory deals a blow to the exclusively rational systems of thought, bracket, or any rational system of thought, close bracket, which may have as their grounding an inherent disregard for the inherently personal and sometimes gender-biased nature of knowledge construction. So that's a terrible way of representing it, but the essential statement is true. Feminist ethical theory does deal a blow to reason-based and rationalist and rule-based ethical theory, and I think that's really important. And what that means is it moves ethical knowledge from the realm of explicit knowledge, as Polanyi would describe it, to the realm of tacit knowledge. It doesn't mean that it's no longer knowledge. It just means it's different, it's a lot more complex, and it's a lot harder to get at. And I'm reminded of all of these information management and knowledge management systems from the late 90s, early 2000s that had as their objective to mine tacit knowledge and make it explicit. I remember IBM had a thing for mining emails to pull out the tacit knowledge in emails and all of that. But the thing is, and what none of these systems got, I think, is that if you take tacit knowledge and you make it explicit, you've actually broken the tacit knowledge. The explicit version of tacit knowledge isn't the same, as the tacit version of tacit knowledge. They are actually different pieces of knowledge. So all of this is motivated from what might be called Hume's skepticism. Now, Hume has a variety of skeptical arguments. He's skeptical about causation. There's no necessary connection between one event in the world and the next event in the world. The key word there is necessary. It doesn't mean there's no cause, What it does mean is that a causal relation isn't the same as a deductive relation. Simply because A causes B, that does not give us warrant to deduce B from A. And similar sorts of things are happening with respect to moral knowledge. In the summary by Sam Rainer, we read, we cannot be motivated to act morally through reason alone because reason is only concerned with determining truths about objects already existing in the world. This is in reference to the principle that one cannot derive an ought from an is. And it's the idea that these are two different domains of knowledge. It's similar to the argument regarding causation. It doesn't mean you can't infer from the way things are to the way things should be. There are ways of doing that, but it's not a reason-based inference. It's not a logical deduction. The other thing about Hume's skepticism is that he's very skeptical with ethics and morality as it transpires in the world. And it's interesting, we look at the morality, the statements that people have drawn, and we ask, where did they come from? And Hume's point here is, there is no view of human life, and I'm quoting, or of the condition of mankind from which, without the greatest violence, we can infer the moral attributes. We have all of these moral statements, but again, these cannot be deduced from or inferred from the actual state of affairs in the world. Doesn't stop us from drawing conclusions about them, just like we still draw conclusions about cause and effect, but let's understand the status of these conclusions, right? They're not deductions, they're not inferences. So what are they? Well, one way of getting at this, and getting at Hume's Hume's theory, is to think about what Jack Marshall calls ethics alarms. Quoting from his About page on his website, ethics alarms are the feelings in your gut, the twinges in your conscience, and the sense of caution in your brain when situations involving choice of right and wrong are beginning to develop, fast approaching, or unavoidable. It's not the same as disgust or an ew response, right? But it is the sort of thing that is more characteristic of a feeling than it is an inference like 2 + 2 = 4. The physical feel of the two are quite different. Your reaction to a moral conclusion, your feeling of arriving at one, is very different from your feeling of arriving at a conclusion completely based on the abstract manipulation of ideas. And so it's more like a sensation than a type of cognition. And that's core to Hume's view. We can call this a moral sense. Now, I think it's important here to be clear that this is different from moral intuition. And just to speak to the ethics of care, a lot of people equate what they're talking about with intuition, as in women's intuition or whatever. And I don't think that that's what's intended there either as well. Rather, it's more like a sentiment or a feeling. It's more equivalent to your sense of balance. And you get this feeling when you're off balance. But what's important about it is we're not appealing to some abstract external or abstract or even concrete external reality here. It's just a sensation, right? I might feel off balance for any number of reasons, which may include the fact that I'm off balance. But the fact that I feel off balance does not entail that I am off balance, and it never would, which is why we have skepticism about that. So now let's draw this out into some sort of story about moral sense, and I'll quote from Elizabeth Radcliffe here. Our moral distinctions depend on our experiencing sentiments or feelings. We do not rely exclusively on the employment of reason to make our moral discernments. To a large degree, we do not rely at all on the employment of reason, I would argue, but we'll go with what Radcliffe is saying. Note as well, this is not a theory of innateness or natural morality. We're not saying that we have an inborn awareness of what morality is. It's not a Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, therefore I am moral, or anything like that. But it is the idea that we can learn ethics, but we learn ethics in such a way that we feel or experience a moral sense rather than fully formed general principles. And you might be wondering, well, how can you learn a sense? Think about training your taste buds. A sommelier, for example, a taster of wine, will over time learn how to distinguish different types of wine. Similarly, someone who is a coffee aficionado, like me, will learn to distinguish different types of coffee. I could tell you, if I taste coffee, whether it probably came from South America or East Africa or Hawaii. And to me, they're very distinct, right? Or whether it came from Tim Hortons, the old Tim Hortons, not the new awful Tim Hortons. So they're sensations, but we can augment our capacity to experience these sensations. Okay, so what sort of sensations are they? Well, the reference, and we can go to Adam Smith here, his theory of moral sentiments, is to call them a sentiment. Now, by sentiment here, we don't mean fond reflections of times past. But what we do mean is a feeling similar to fond reflections of time past. Any sort of affective feeling that we might have. It's not emotion in the sense of anger or fear or hope or desire. It's actually a much more gentle and subtle kind of feeling. But it is a feeling. So here, to quote Smith, to be amiable and to be meritorious, that is, to deserve love and to deserve reward, are the great characters of virtue, and to be odious and punishable of vice. But all these characters, he writes, have an immediate reference to the sentiment of others. In other words, the idea of being amiable is being perceived by others as being amiable. In other words, when other people interact with you, they have a sensation that we would describe as something like, that person is amiable. Just like love, right? When we interact with a person, we may experience a sensation that we have after the fact called love. Now, I think love is a good example here because amiability, love, odiousness, these are all experienced in different ways to different degrees by different people. And there's no presumption, and this is why we say it's not a kind of naturalism or a kind of innatism. There's no presumption that everybody experiences all of these in the same way. And in fact, these words that we are using to characterize these sentiments are rough approximations or categorizations at best. They're what we can do with the tools that we have. So, but there is this sense that we have of this classification of feelings that we'll call sentiments, and these sentiments are what constitute our inclinations to call something meritorious or to call something odious and punishable. Now, that is a very different model from, I think, most people's models of what morality is. Most people, I think, would follow a rationalist model where they think about what is right and what is wrong. They make judgments about the actions of people in the world, and then they feel the emotion. So they decide, oh, stealing that bread was wrong. You should be punished. Sometimes we can have a dual process model, which is a combination of reason and emotion to render a judgment. Sometimes we can have an intuitionist model, which begins with the emotion, but actually plays out as a judgment, which is then applied through reason. But the sentimentalist model is more about what our emotions are, and sometimes the interaction between that emotion and reason. Jonathan Haidt talks about this most recently, talking about the idea that moral judgments are, for the most part, intuitions proximately caused by gut reactions, quick and automatic flashes of effect. And why do we say this? Well, a couple of things. People, he says, are easily dumbfounded when challenged on their moral views. What do you mean you're not sure why I think murder is wrong? Everybody thinks murder is wrong. That sort of reaction, right? And when you press them, says Haidt, they can't really give reasons for why they disapprove of a moral action. Now, that could be questioned, right? Because people do give reasons, but he says that's just rationalization after the fact. And it may well be. Again, though, the idea is that morality originates in sentiment or emotion. Emotion really is the wrong word here. I really prefer to use the word like sentiment rather than emotion, because I think emotion refers to one class of feelings, sentiment refers to another class of feelings. There's some overlap, but not all emotions are sentiments, and not all sentiments are emotions. And I think sentiment is more descriptive of the feelings that result in feelings of morality than emotion. Okay, we have Hume's position then. We have the idea that it's a type of sentimentalism because he believes that morality arises from human sentiments, and it's something that he repeats many times in different places in his work. And he says very explicitly, when you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature, whatever it happens to be, you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. Now here, when we're talking about the constitution of your nature, he's not talking about one's essential human nature or anything like that. The constitution of your nature is the physical state of affairs of your body and your brain at this particular time. This is sometimes called naturalism, and Hume's approach is sometimes called a naturalist approach to ethics, but it's a bit different from the naturalism that can be thought of as, whatever is in nature, that must be the case. That's where we get our inferences about moral judgments from. That's not quite it. I think it's better to think of Hume's naturalism as an explanation of where we get our moral sentiments from, rather than an argument or reasoning for the viability or the soundness of our moral judgments. We can't argue for the viability or soundness of our moral judgments. Well, we can say that I have this moral judgment because this is how I feel. And that is actually a line of reasoning that makes a lot of sense to a lot of people when you put it to them that way, right? Why is murder wrong? Uh, well, because I feel that it's wrong. Is there any argument that would overrule your feeling that murder is wrong? Well, maybe not. Right? Maybe evidence or experiences, but not some kind of rationalist argument. Ethical sentimentalism. Try that again. Ethical sentimentalism promises a conception of morality that is grounded in a realist account of human psychology. That's the explanation part, which correspondingly acknowledges the central place of emotion in our moral lives. Or, as Hume would say, reason is and always must be a slave of the passions. So, this leads to something like what my perspective on an ethics would be. An ethics, or a morality, for a person is something that is learned through experience. So, over time, through our development and growth in life and interactions with the community and other people, and maybe things like volcanoes and tigers, we develop an ethical perspective. Not in the sense of we develop a set of rules, but we develop a nature such that when we're presented with a state of affairs, we have a certain experience. And this is very similar to Hume's moral sentiment. I think of this as something that happens at a sub-symbolic level. In other words, it's a type of tacit knowledge, a type of personal knowledge. It's ineffable. It's not a matter of rationality, as Kant would say, but rather one of sympathy. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. And I wrote about that a while back in a post called The Failure of Reason. And so how we react in a particular case, because we really can't generalize on this. Well, we might find patterns and regularities, but really we need to look at the particular case, and how we react in a particular case depends on our ethical background. That is to say, all of those experiences that we've had. And it is the result of multiple simultaneous factors, not large print key statements like thou shalt not kill. So sympathy, again, when we talk about sympathy, we're probably talking more about an explanation for the feelings that we have, as opposed to a justification or argument as to why we should have them. So Hume, and here we're quoting the article we've been quoting all along, sees what he calls sympathy as the underlying foundation of the interpersonal nature of human morality. By sympathy, Hume is referring to the human ability to convey our moral sentiments to one another upon observing the outward effects of someone else's internal moral sentiments, our ability to actually feel those sentiments as though they were our own. So maybe empathy might be the better word than sympathy, but Hume is using the word sympathy. Now, in modern usage, sympathy means, like pity or a desire to console someone. And empathy means feeling what they're feeling, more or less, right? So Hume is talking about feeling what they're feeling. And there are different ways of feeling what they're feeling. Mostly it's through their outward expression of whatever it is. They say, ouch, I'm in pain, or something like that. That's very similar to the concept of expressed needs that we talk about in ethics of care. But also, sometimes on observing an event, we, as it were, naturally have this mirroring sensation in ourselves corresponding to what we think they must be feeling. Not what we think they must be feeling, but corresponding to what we bracket, infer, come to conclude. None of those words are right? Because it's not a cognitive mental process. But you see somebody being eaten by a tiger, and you go, ew, no, ouch, right? You haven't done any reasoning or cognitive projection or anything like that. You're just feeling what they're feeling. Not exactly what they're feeling, because of course they're being eaten by a tiger and you're not. But there's some sympathy there, right? Some awareness of what they must be feeling. These days, this is attributed to things like mirror neurons. And so there may be an explanation an easy explanation right at the neural level for that. There are probably also other factors involved as well. I wouldn't say that it's going to be simply mirror neurons. There's going to be a whole host of things involved. Nonetheless, there is this mechanism we have, and this is what the important part here is, of communicating what our sentiments are to other people, either directly through expression or indirectly through the other person's sympathy with us. And that allows ethics and morality to be not just a personal thing, but a community thing. The expression of our moral sentiments can be talked about in language of moral judgments. You see the distinction here, right? To have a moral sentiment is to have a feeling or emotion, which is our personal reaction, ineffable and all of that, to a particular situation. A moral judgment's when we actually say something about that. Our moral judgment may arise from actual sympathy, but we express it, and then, as Glossop says, by correcting them through reflecting on them with an imagined impartiality, we can attempt to make moral judgments by adopting the sentiments, right? So, if you see somebody push somebody toward a tiger, and you see the person being eaten by a tiger, you may feel that what that person did was wrong, and they should not have pushed the person toward a tiger. If you say you should not have pushed that person toward the tiger, you've taken your sentiment and converted it to a moral judgment. And then you can now begin to gradually abstract on that, right? People shouldn't push other people toward tigers. Now, that's probably not a good basis for a morality, what is, but you can see how a community-based morality would begin to develop through a set of these interactions. And so there's been a lot of work, especially on the sociological and ethnographic side of the literature, on just how society and how these interactions work together to create some kind of community sense of morality. And I just want to put in a bracketed remark here, because I had an argument, and I think I referred to this earlier in the course, with somebody on Twitter about what appropriate behavior was on Twitter. And so what's happening is that this person believes that they're creating some kind of community morality by expressing moral judgments about that behavior on Twitter. I don't think it works that way so easily and explicitly, right? There are many other ways in which these moral sentiments are communicated one person to the other. And explicit moral judgments is just one, and probably the least important of them all. And certainly, at least in my experience, the least effective of them all. But there's this idea that, oh no, you just get together in a room, you argue it out, and then you get morality. No, this is the whole concept of the idea that morality and ethics are not things you arrive at through reasoned argument. So you can't take a bunch of moral judgments and make an ethical system out of it. That's not how it works. Because if it did work, then we'd have a very strange kind of ontology that we're working with. So and this is a hard quote. It's from Pink, just last year. Take away the very concept of power, of a capacity to produce or prevent outcomes, and there is nothing left to base a distinctively moral responsibility. Okay, so if the other person can just argue and force me to accept a particular perspective, then where's my moral responsibility in that? Continuing the quote, but nor is there anything left of something very much part of our conception of rationality, a power of justifications to move us. That's true. But I think that, as I said, with the Twitter example, the justifications, quote unquote, do not have that power to move us. That's not what produces the moral sentiments, which are the things that move us. Sure, any given moral judgment may contribute to the overall experiences, the overall set of experiences in a lifetime that produce moral sentiments. But you don't go from one judgment to one moral sentiment to compliant behavior. The causal chain just isn't that neat, and I've never seen it work. You can find counterexamples if you want. I mean, this is an empirical thing, right, that we can test. So how do we learn ethics? Right? Because we do learn ethics. Just like, we've said in the past, people aren't born racist, they learn to be racist. People aren't born ethical, they learn to be ethical. Rousseau, to the contrary, perhaps notwithstanding. Here's how I think it works, more or less. So we'll begin, and this is Jacqueline Taylor's summarizing of Hume. Hume says that our sense of humanity allows us to form general views about the useful and agreeable, to which the relativist does not subscribe, and that we do so on the basis of conversations and debates in which we must make ourselves mutually intelligible to one another. Now, I'm not really sure that that's a good interpretation of Hume. I think that's kind of a conventional interpretation. It's almost like, I don't want to say a liberal interpretation of Hume, liberal with small l, in the sense of, the liberal society where you get a bunch of educated people in a room and they talk very agreeably and have conversations and all eventually get together to find what morality must be. I really don't think that that's Hume at all. But I do think that if you take that description and remove all the specificity out of it, like general views or even usefulness or agreeableness or mutual intelligibility, take all of that out of it, because all of that is imposing a structure on Hume which really doesn't deserve to be imposed. Then we might say it takes a community to learn ethics. All we do, all we experience, everything, is the data from which a person develops an ethical sense. Just like any other part of our knowledge. All of our experiences of grandma, including seeing pictures of grandma in the photo album, are what enable us to recognize grandma when she comes through the train station. All of our experiences of good behavior, bad behavior, indifferent behavior are what lead us to develop an ethical sense about what's happening in front of us now, where we recognize good behavior, where we recognize vice. And all of this is happening not on the basis of rules or anything like that, but subsymbolically in the inner workings of our brain, our neurons connecting with each other. So, it makes it hard to model ethics. This is a paper which is interesting, but it sort of makes my point and sort of doesn't make my point. Because earlier we talked about modeling as being part of the learning process. And this paper looked at modeling ethics specifically, and it compared two things: leader ethical role modeling and leader safety role modeling. And it found that the safety modeling worked, but the ethical modeling didn't. However, it also found, and I quote, the mediation of moral sympathy, moral contempt, and moral anger and disgust in the relationship between leader ethical role modeling and morally courageous behaviors. So there's no direct link between the role modeling of ethical behavior and the morally courageous behavior among employees. But these moral emotions do participate as mediating factors. So what does that tell me? Well, here's what it tells me. You don't have a nice one-to-one relationship between a leader modeling ethical behavior and employees emulating that ethical behavior. And why would you? All kinds of things impact employees, especially with regard to morality. With safety and safety processes, there's not nearly as much exposure to those sorts of specific recommendations just in the day-to-day world, so you might expect somebody explicitly modeling safety behavior might have more of an impact. But everybody exhibits moral judgments, ethical behavior, good and bad and indifferent. And so a particular example is probably going to be less impactful on an employee. But what really bothered me about this paper was the way it sort of set up a relationship between leader and staff, right? And with respect to ethics, I don't think that relation necessarily holds. I don't think that people, simply by virtue of being a leader, thereby become an ethical role model. At least I hope not, because our leaders have been disappointing us since the beginning of time with respect to being ethical role models. And I think we learn as much from each other as we do from our leaders. Our leaders call that peer pressure, but we might just call it community. And that's what it takes, right? It takes a community as an entire system rather than one individual making a decision. Any given individual may experience a moral sentiment, may express a moral judgment, and that's fine. But all of the people that we're connected to have an influence on what our moral sense develops into. And we need to keep in mind how we're connected, what the nature of this connection is, and what's influencing those connections, to understand how our own personal sense of morality and ethics is forming. What's important in ethics is how we learn to be ethical in the first place. Right? It's not about what the rules are or what counts as ethical or non-ethical. That doesn't matter at all. What matters is how do we learn to be ethical, because that is going to be what is ethics in our own mind, whatever it is, for good or bad. And we know that communities can organize themselves in biased ways, unfair ways, in ways that disadvantage communities, in ways that assign proportional influence to some members, etc. That's what that whole previous, manager-employee thing was trying to do, was to set up one of these imbalanced relationships. So it takes a community but the community isn't perfect. There's no inference from the community believes P, therefore P. That would be a fallacy. So, where do we conclude? We have a thing that we can call the ethical mind. The ethical mind is that part of ourselves that produces moral sentiments. A person's mind, or a person's brain, because, I mean basically the same thing when I say the word mind or brain, is at least as complex as social networks. So just like we have a moral community out there in the community, we have a moral community in here in our head. What that mind learns is going to be based on the data. It's going to be based on the totality of the input. That's also going to be true of a computer system, any network. And this isn't something that can be corrected simply by rote or by rules. Right? You can't just argue for a certain type of morality. You can't, by a rule or principle or fiat, convince a person that their sense of morality is wrong, etc. It is, our moral sense is what it is, and the only way to change our moral sense is to go through more experiences. So, if we want to develop an ethical mind, we need to do something like provide an ethical culture, because that's what's creating the ethical mind. What does that mean? Well, that's where a lot of the feminist ethics and the duty of care comes in and is really useful for our purposes. For example, developing a diversity of perspective to create a wider sense of community, or, for example, encouragement of openness and interaction, art, drama, whatever, to develop empathy and a capacity to see from the perspective of others. Now, in the next module, we're going to be looking at the data flow, the workflow involved in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and analytics. But we want to be keeping these things in mind, because at every step of the process, we're making decisions about how we're training our analytics engine, how we're developing our models. And we need to be aware that instead of trying to train our models with ethical principles, we need to be thinking about the overall community, in other words, the overall body of data that they're exposed to as a result of their training, even including elements of that data which we might not think have an ethical import. And then that's going to lead us to some kind of description of what we think ethical practices are overall. How we develop this ethical community, which would result in the ethical mind, either of the human kind or of the artificial kind. So that's it for this for now. Thanks for joining me. I'm Stephen Downs, and this, at last, is the end of Module 6. See you again.